Hey everybody. As always, if you haven't already, if you could put your name in the meeting notes, which I just pasted into the chat. Appreciate it. Who else? Who's here so far? Who was here last week? Okay. I don't know if any more folks are going to join. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Good to see you all again. The only items added to the agenda were the SLSA 1.0 proposal, so continuing from where we picked up last week. There's been some discussion in the doc, if you've seen it, mostly around the splitting. So since last week, I had split. We had the idea of splitting out, like postponing the definition of SLSA 4. So I added that to the doc. I also had a suggestion based on what we discussed last week of like splitting out like source levels for versus build levels. So we could discuss that and see what it looks like. And also I wanted to note that I added a reviews line to each section, just so we could record people who have like explicitly looked at it and either kind of gave it a thumbs up or thumbs down. You could maybe dig that through comments history or something like that, but that's a huge pain to do. So it's easier to just like record that information there. And so if you do have thoughts on any section, adding your name with like some, I listed a couple suggested emoji or comments would be appreciated. Just little brief things. So I see. Someone's adding also the policy model from last week. So let's add time to discuss that at the end. So let's maybe start with the thing that I think maybe we could get the most agreement on quickly, and I could present. Sorry, I have to do some tab management here. Okay. In the proposal, let me see how to present my screen. Sorry for the lack of preparedness. Share screen, window, 1.0 proposal. Okay, great. So hopefully this is big enough to see. So as a reminder, we talked about versioning that I marked as decided. The evidence of security claims I want to talk about later if we have time. So the one proposal is to postpone the definition of SLSA 4. Effectively, in the 1.0 specification, we would define the first 3 levels and list prospective requirements for future levels, like the 2-party review, hermetic, reproducible, possibly some other things that are under discussion. But don't formally define SLSA yet. Basically, we undefine SLSA 4 with some sort of footnote explaining like what happened to it and what our thoughts are. And then we will finalize SLSA 4 in a future release. I believe this is what we had discussed, and I didn't get any other further comments on it in the doc, but I just wanted to bring it up now just to make sure. Yeah, like Mike.
Oh yeah. No. So I think I agree with the postponing of the definition of SLSA 4, but I still think we should at least have somewhere where our current thinking is for SLSA 4, so that folks who are looking to go above and beyond and go to that next level, that they can sort of prepare themselves for like, hey, where we might be thinking, not necessarily we agreed on it, but where we might be thinking. Because like, for example, was it SUSE, right, has more or less, it seems like they're more or less salsa 4 for most things. And we still think that's good work, right? Like, we don't want that's not good work. And but I do agree with the other pieces of a lot of the confusion around it, since there are folks who are also claiming salsa 4, but in also a nebulous sort of way. And given a lot of the confusion around it, it's also, I think, that's causing some problems here.
That sounds good. I think the main thing I want to avoid is having something that people start calling salsa 4, even if we say it's informal. So as long as we get the messaging right to make it clear, like, please don't call this salsa 4 yet because it's subject to change, that sounds good to me. I think Joshua had also suggested something similar as well. So are we good marking this as decided? Any objections or comments? Okay. And to be clear, decided here just means among this group. We still will put the full proposal, to the public group and get it approved. But just for our own tracking purposes, so we don't kind of, we know what where the decisions need to be made and where we've already made decisions. Okay. So let me just yes. So the other is this notion of separate build versus source levels. I don't, the idea being that we rename what we currently have to terminology pending build levels, or provenance levels, or build integrity levels, or something like that. So instead of saying I'm salsa 3, you'd say I'm salsa build level 3, or build integrity 3, or something like that. And the guarantee is about the trustworthiness of the build process and the resulting provenance. And the only where source comes to play would just be that the builder identifies what the source is, but does not necessarily say any properties of the source like that. So two-party review, retention of the source is separate, et cetera, would be a separate property. And then we would, similar to the level 4 discussion around like a tentative level, we would have a source levels that we would define in a future revision, but not in 1.0. And so this would be the current source requirements we have now would be the start. There's also some discussion around like, should we add more requirements? Like, should you have commit signing? Should you have something about testing of the source code? Like how you know if it's any good? We could decide all of that down the road, but we would just call it like draft or something for 1.0, but wouldn't actually lock in the definition yet. So that's the proposal that we have written. It seems like we got some feedback from folks that it's generally positive. It adds complexity, which I don't love, and I think no one loves. But it seems like it's a decent compromise. There was also a question of like, should we have it? Well, I think the two big, aside from general comments and feedback, the two big open questions are, one, what should we call them? Should we call them build levels versus provenance versus build integrity? The main idea is build level. Those were the main ideas so far. And the source one, we could just figure out later. I'm not too worried about the naming there. And then should we have a term for like shorthand for salsa 3 means build level 3 plus source level 3 for something? Because in practice, people are going to say salsa 3 as a shorthand. And so it's probably better to be ahead of that. Brandon?
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether this has been talked about before, but like, so other than the source and build levels, do we envision kind of having other kind of classifications as well?
Yeah, I think it's conceivable that we would have other levels. Um,
So I'm just wondering, right? Like not, right now, I think it's like source build provenance and just more general. Um, and would we be scoping out the general stuff and the and combining the provenance with the build? How would that work?
sorry, I don't think I followed. Anyone else?
So I mean, I think to Brendan's point is I think it's like the general SLSA scoping question of like, is SLSA going to get into you should be doing software composition analysis, right? I think it's that kind of thing that we just want to figure out. Like, are they going to also be doing stuff like I don't know, like when running your build, you should do this sort of security linting or whatever. I think that's kind of where we want to sort of set those bounds and like, I mean, my 2 cents is always like, if there's something out there that already does this, I think the SLSA build security or whatever, however else we want to kind of like word that, could be some other thing. And just sort of cite that other thing, whether it's, you know, something coming out of NIST or something coming out of some other thing, or it's something that we want to eventually get to. And I say that just because as folks start to adopt the build provenance and start to adopt some of the other pieces, there's going to be an open question of, okay, well, what's like, is it on, is build, like general build security, like use software composition, use this other thing, yada, yada, is that on the roadmap, even if it's not something that you're looking at right now? Or is it something that you're saying, no, 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 this is completely out of our scope and we're not going to address it?
All right.
Yeah, I like having this separation between source and build. One worry I have is what happens if someone builds from a tarball and not a Git repository. Like, even if you have build level 3, I don't think you can do any sort of verification because you don't really have the ground truth of what you build from. Let's say if the source is a tarball in a GCP bucket, you can't really fetch that bucket later and say this was the ground truth because it might have been tampered with by someone else. So I'm just wondering how, is there at least a minimum requirement on the source before you can say that build level 3 is useful? I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. In my mind, the build level is just identifying what those inputs were. Like at level 3 would be the top level config. At level 4 would be like the sort, you know, all of the transit dependencies that are required at build time. And so like if it's a tarball, it would be identified by hash. I guess whether it's available for inspection later, I would put as tentatively in the source requirements. And that actually kind of comes to the other thing I wanted to bring up, which is like first party versus or enterprise versus open source versus vendor. We might want to split the ladder out there because like making sources available doesn't work if it's not open source. So anyway, that's what I was thinking. Michael, or who else? Did someone else raise their hand?
I did, but sorry, we can move on.
So yeah, so the build level is like really just about identifying what the build process was and what, like, ideally content addressable, what the sources were. But availability would be something else.
So,
Yeah, that
so I
works
have a
for
quick
me.
question. Is like this only going to be for L3, or are people going to also be able to say like salsa built L2 as well?
Do you mean like you could be build level 3, source level 1?
Yeah, or like how do you envision it being kind of mapped onto? Like are these treated as like, would someone say, like, would it be salsa 1, salsa 2, and then salsa build level 3 versus like, okay, I'm salsa build level 2, but sauce level 1, or I'm a salsa build level 3, sauce level 2. How do you envision it being used by people?
I think the current proposal is that if you refer to just salsa level X, then that's everything at the same level. And if you have things at different levels, you have to refer to them by the individual ladder. And that's why there's some reluctance about the proposal, because it adds that complexity, particularly around communication, which is why the proposal suggests that we get out in front of naming by stating if you claim salsa level X, then you have to meet all requirements of that level.
Yeah, one thing just to really sort of drive home is we really want to make sure that there is some element of an outcome, right? You know, these salsa levels are generally doing things for you, and you know, whatever that takes. And so like, yeah, you might be salsa level 3 build providence, but let's say in the future you're salsa level 1 some other thing, you probably are not getting the full, this is what salsa 3 gets you. And we just want to make that clear.
I'm wondering also whether it's maybe beneficial to not have explicit like across the board salsa levels, because like I think like the scoping of salsa also is meant to be pretty narrow, and so like I think once we, like when we're doing the mapping against all the compliance stuff, right, we'll be mapping, you know, the specific levels of the specific areas of salsa. So I just wondering whether it would be, we would want to say to kind of not refer to that as a broad, like salsa 2 means you have everything. Yeah.
So are you suggesting, I'm not sure if you're suggesting, but there's one of the alternatives considered, which is effectively the only salsa levels would be the build levels. And then we just call that salsa 3. And then we describe all these other sets of stuff would just not be leveled. And they would just be kind of individual properties, like was it two-party or, you know, two-party review, availability of the sources, / retention, vulnerability scanning, SCA, et cetera. So in this example, it would be like, you'd say salsa 3 plus two-party review.
Yeah. I think at least like the way I'm seeing this is when we start to include additional kind of pillars with source build and everything else. Like I'm not sure, besides for marketing purposes, whether it's beneficial to have a labeling on, you know, I'm salsa tree across the board, rather for like kind of practical policy making decisions. I'm kind of seeing this as a way to maybe reduce the complexity, by saying that, you know, you shouldn't refer to, like, salsa is defined as like the pillars and not as like general levels.
So you're saying like, don't do this, like salsa, don't ever say salsa 3 because it's ambiguous.
Yeah, I think at least that's my opinion.
I think it's, to be fair, that the public at some point will want a single thing to be called. I think it's going to tend towards that way no matter what we try and do here. I do not want to drop the source code out of the salsa levels period. I think we're going to add more as time goes by. Like, where's your Bootstrap compilers and tools come from? Aren't really a build specific thing.
So Roy, are you saying like this? Are you voting against this split in general?
I think we need to keep the source in there and be very clear that it's part of the whole package, because I don't think bundling it all and dropping things out because they're hard to explain are going to help anybody. We kind of need the levels, and if we want to continue to break them apart as this is source versus build, we're going to get more classifications as we go forward.
Yeah, for the record, I'm really split on this. I don't really like either option. I don't see anyone as like looking particularly good. I think the complexity of having multiple build versus source levels is kind of undesirable. Bundling it all together is undesirable for the reasons that we already listed now. So just to get opinions, there's this alternative of like, effectively we have one set of levels and then a bunch of like kind of checkboxes for other things. Any thoughts, positive or negative, on that?
Yeah. There's too much to say and or write. I think it like the granularity is only going to explode, and it's going to be almost impossible to describe. You're going to end up with like 2 slides in your document just describing what SLSA level you adhere to.
Marcella?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with Joshua. If someone has two-party review and source availability, now you sort of have to tack on 2 additional things, or at least have a way to start specifying all of the additional checkboxes that they've marked, right? And so then eventually we end up honestly starting to just need a way to express any such thing, which is kind of what in my mind SLSA is already trying to do. I guess what I'm saying is we sort of end up back to where we are right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I too am concerned about having many individual levels you end up with. It makes the result really difficult to compare.
I think one thing,
So,
yeah, thanks. Oh, go. Someone's about to speak.
Oh no, yeah, I wanted to ask, like, what is exactly the complexity we're afraid of, that there's too many combinations of options?
For me personally, it's one is describing which SLSA level you adhere to. If there's a bunch of kind of add-on options, but also one of the strongest appeals of SLSA is the tractability with the leveling. You just go 1, 2, 3, and if it's not 1, 2, 3, it's 1 plus. Well, I can't even imagine how the additional constraints fit into the leveling, and I really like the leveling and the kind of incrementality of it. So that's a concern.
So would it be so? Is there a way that we can separate builders levels versus build levels? Because like the builder, I think levels for builders kind of make sense because there is a set of agreed upon, best practices and requirements that need to be met. But then once you move to artifacts, it seems that that's where there's a lot of differences in practice. But I think the requirements on artifacts themselves, they don't have that much, like there isn't a lot of freedom or degrees of freedom. It's basically 3 or 4, I guess, maybe requirements. So maybe that's not as complex as, you know, the whole, like all the requirements that you see today in the, like the salsa.dev?
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think for me, one of the big things is, and I think you hit on it, is like I can definitely see, right, because we've already been talking about the differences between salsa builders versus salsa builds, like builds that happen through the salsa process. And in certain cases, one of the reasons why we've even been pushing back against the source requirements is trying to better understand what tools even support certain things today, like two-party code review, or as you sort of mentioned, like if you know, if we're pulling the code from Git versus something else, like what does that actually look like? And so there's like almost like an element of salsa builder versus an approved salsa store, you know, code, you know, code repo or whatever. And then, but I think one of the things that still seems to be here is like there's potentially new requirements that increase the scope of salsa. Like there's things that we're not exactly sure how we want to define it, and so we don't want to include it as a requirement. And then we probably want to increase the scope to then include those things. And how do you communicate that in a clear and consistent way where, you know, folks don't feel like, oh no, now I have, like, you know, it was salsa 3 yesterday and you're telling me on the new one I'm, you know, not even salsa 1 anymore because you've added all these new requirements.
Okay. So in terms of making progress, it sounds like we'll go forward with this proposal of like having the 2 different sets of levels, because I think that's what I heard, that most people seemed like that was their preference. Mark that as resolved. Put your name down already. I think we'll probably get a better idea once we actually see it written down. But I think we discussed enough that we have some idea. This is still kind of an issue. I think it maybe will come down to communication there, of like how we communicate what that shorthand means. Maybe we discourage saying that, but say if someone says it, it should mean this. Any other votes on what to call it?
So
Also
Mark,
added.
Mark, I have
Yeah.
a question for you. So if
Yeah.
I was to produce a template-only library, and the only thing the build process did was a packaging step, what do you think that would show up on a salsa level? Is it only source code, or like how do you represent something that's only code as a package?
I don't think I follow. You're saying like there was like a null build step?
Yeah, basically all you're doing is bundling into a, let's say, a NuGet or an NPM package, the STL library, right? It's just source code, which is header only library. There's nothing built out of the product. You have somebody claiming that it's safe and secure because they hand audited and did 2-party code reviews. That's the only thing you've got to the base that's safe on.
I think the, I mean, the build there would be transforming it in something that is like from the original form that it's modified in, like the, let's say Git or Mercurial or whatever, into a tarball or a zip or an npm package. Like that is a build, because it is not like, you can't just look you can't compare the two and say, oh, this tarball is definitely comes from the source code because it's transformed in some way. It's not bit for bit identical. Like if you were distributing literally a Git tree, then like the hash is the same and it's trivial to check. But if you have a zip file with a bunch of files, you need, like that transformation is the build. And so if it is
its value is a hell of a lot diminished than it is if we actually built a binary, right? And I'm saying, hey, the fact that you would have very little build attestation or evidence means that the source levels become super important, and therefore what the end user or the person validating and auditing come back with and say, hey, this is SLSA level 3 or 4. You shouldn't necessarily expect there to be anything in one of these categories at some point. Or you're always expecting to have something in the build and the source space.
Yeah, we definitely do expect there to be stuff for the build. It's, yeah, I agree with you that it's sort of less useful information, because if at the end of the day it's just a tarball, you're like, okay, great, you didn't really do a whole lot, but I mean, it's still useful to know that, yeah, this thing was actually tarred up. But and yeah, it does make, oh, go ahead.
I agree, which is why I'm saying, hey, when you start looking at
the
equivalence of the different outputs, I think the statements that we want people to believe in is the same, which is it's SLSA level 3 or SLSA level 4, regardless of whether it's source or build.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one. So does that, oh, you know what, never mind.
So I don't think I fully appreciated your comment, Roy. Oh, Laurent?
Yeah, I wanted to add as well that it's in some NPM packages, well, maybe a few of them, sometimes it's not at the root of the directory that the tarball creation happens. So SLSA level 3 can actually give you the exact command that you can use to reproduce it without having to like manually look up the source code and try a combination of options to rebuild. So I think in that sense, it's also a transformation and it's valuable.
I'm not arguing that it's not valuable. I'm just saying, hey, the importance of a completely isolated build step with tools you understood and that they have all the same security patches, and doesn't necessarily apply to a header only library where all you're doing is a packaging step, because you could be sidestepping the fact that you don't have to use a Git repo or submodule with credentials to go and retrieve the content if they come out of a package. I'm just want the end user's belief in that it's safe and secure and trustworthy. We are trying to say is based on the SLSA level, not how it came there. And that I wouldn't treat the build SLSA evidence as being more important in that case than the source SLSA levels. In fact, I would think it was highly skewed to the source one.
Oh yeah. I don't think there's any claim. That's why I think we need to be clear about like what SLSA the build levels do and don't provide. And we should not make any claims like this code is secure or it is good or something. Just that you have confidence that this artifact that you have really came from this source. That's really all it's claiming. I actually would argue that even in a source-only distribution, the build levels still matter because people could inject code that wasn't in version control. So even if you have two-party review and every, et cetera, it's not meaningful if there, well, not that it's not meaningful. There is a significant threat that during the tarballing process, someone could inject code that doesn't at all reflect. So even if you're reviewing everything that goes into the Git commit, into the Git repo, there's no guarantee, well, that it's actually reflected in what's distributed to users until you have a sufficient SLSA build level. But yeah, definitely, I agree with your point that, and I think we maybe made this other place too, that we need to be clear on what SLSA does and doesn't value. Marcella?
I also wanted to just add that we probably really want to be clear what we mean by, and I think this is what a few people are saying before, clear what we mean by source and build, because when we say source, we're not actually talking about the source code files themselves, right? We're talking about how the source is managed, even though maybe source is shorthand for source management or something like that. But yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I'll try to add a comment in the doc. name might be misleading. I think it depends what we ultimately choose to make the levels, but yeah, I agree with you. Similarly, how like the build level isn't very accurate because it's kind of just identifying, it's kind of really about the provenance of like, if you have provenance, you can trust it. Or like the level of confidence in the provenance, I guess is maybe the most accurate way to say that. Maybe I'll just, for the proposal, I'll just pick one of these names, since it seems like we're pretty split on what the naming should be, and then leave that to the broader community to vote, so we have just more opinions on the naming, and leave it still as like a TBD when we actually kind of publish the proposal. Does that sound okay? Since there's not like overwhelming support for any one of these names. Okay. There's 20 minutes left. I feel like, okay, so should we, is there more to discuss here, or should we call that decided for now?
I mean, I think you'd call it decided. I haven't heard.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. I'll go through and clean up the comments. If you have anything else that's in the comments that you want that should be reflected in the doc, please just make a suggestion or say so. Otherwise, I'll mark the comments as resolved. And for this question, I think we'll just come up with something in the pull request that actually implements. Okay, this evidence of security claims, I don't want to spend much time on this, but I just want to be able to make progress here. I think this is the next kind of one to get agreement on. Within the next minute or two, well, first, let me ask that folks kind of look at this and add thoughts. If you think this is just good to go, if you could just add your name down here, or if you think that there's something else to do, add a comment, and then we could discuss it next week. And if there's any suggestions you want me to make in the doc, you could either suggest it yourself or ask me to do that. But we'll do that offline because I don't want to take time now because I want to have time for the other topics. And then let's handle, there's a question about like whether the provenance format is calling that 1.0 as a blocker for calling the specification 1.0. Any thoughts on that? The provenance being the particular in toto schema versus like the level definitions. Like, are we tying the two versions together? We want to release both at the same time, or are we releasing one before the other?
I think given that, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was gonna say, it says comment from Emmy, and I'm trying to pinpoint what I was talking about if I made that comment.
Oh yeah, sorry. That was, you had a question down somewhere.
Yeah, let me see if I can open mine. Sorry about that.
Here you go. I think we should sort this out prior to view 1.0. So maybe I misinterpreted your question.
No, 2 weeks is a long time in my head.
That's fine. I'd say let's just postpone until next week then. And if you want to just relook at it and try to reformulate it for next week.
I mean, you can resolve that comment.
Just hit resolve?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll just say never mind here. Sorry, Joshua, were you going to say something?
I mean, do we want to resolve the question of whether we can like release 1.0 of the spec without 1.0 of the provenance format? feeling is that given the spec says you don't have to use the provenance format, but here's a handy format that meets the provenance requirements, then they can be versioned separately.
That was my inclination as well, that like they're not necessarily tied to each other. We probably want to develop a draft for both to make sure they agree. But I wouldn't say it's a hard blocker.
Oh, I think it was kind of like capturing all of, there's been a lot of comments throughout the document about this, but it was basically treating the issue of how are people going out and saying that they've reached SLSA level whatever, and that we should probably sort out how to reach it, or like what you have to provide in order to reach it prior to coming out with version 1. Like that should be kind of just something we sort out. I think that's where I was going with that.
Yeah, so I think that's the evidence of security claims piece, or at least part of it is that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to use the remaining time. Vita added an item for the policy model, continuing the policy model discussion from last week. Vita?
It always helps to unmute. What I presented last week was the first few items in a design that I've been working on. Joshua Locke commented on my slides. Thank you, Josh. But he was commenting on something way at the end where the details are that that I did not discuss. So what I did was I translated the part that I presented, actually, the highlights, the highest level concepts. I translated that into an English text for easier discussions. So it is the same material, it's just easier to digest. And I would like to solicit comments on this. So these are the core ideas of policy, not even policy format, not even policy management, that I would like to share. So that's what I have. I'm not going through the presentation again. That would not make sense. But it's basically, why do we need a policy that binds the source code to the artifact, and what kind of policy can we expect to use for this, without going into the details of formats and management and so on, because those details are really, really tricky. So the goal is to break this whole story up into small chunks, get agreements on the small parts, and then make progress. Somebody was saying something.
Yeah, I struggle with bringing policy predicates into what we already have. It sounds more like heading towards the classical in toto model of here's the recipe and you're going to check as you go through it. And that doesn't work in a lot of the incremental cache build scenarios that we're working through. And I think that's going to bog down and stall out if we try to bring it into here at this point.
Okay, well, let's see when we get there. Right?
Yeah, go for it.
I should have raised my hand. My question is the statement to be agreed with that SLSA 4 malware can be distributed? Is it this like a yes, no, or is there some other statement you would like me to say yes or no to?
Oh, the example shows that you can distribute SLSA 4 malware if you have a policy that does not look at the source provenance.
Okay, thank you for making that clear.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. It means that I should add a few words of redundancy to make sure that people stay on track instead of going off the rails. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the how we include, if and how we include this into the ladder is a somewhat independent question that we'll do as part of the 1.0 proposal, to Roy's point. For this doc here, I think, and actually I was going to raise this question of what do we want to do with this doc, and like how do we incorporate that into the SLSA, site. One way could be that we have this like model and terminology page. That could be one way, or create something around SLSA controls or something like that. We have like a very, very bare bones page in the repo that's not actually published on the website. It's like in some folder that's not the docs folder, that has like a couple sentences. This is obviously like a much more detailed version of that. Yeah, I think basically what we would be agreeing on is the model, particularly like the policy is binding a project to a source repo.
Yep.
Oh, and in particular, the notion of like, can you distribute malware? I think this is particularly for a, like if we think about the NPM proposal, where we have SLSA integration into the NPM ecosystem, Node Package Manager, is that if you do like signature checking and verification of provenance, like in the tool at install time or at upload time, you need to have some notion of what the expected source repo is. And without that, you will be subject to these significant attacks where someone could build with the proper build process. Let's pretend GitHub Actions, because that's the one that was named in the proposal. But it would still be bad. And so there's still threats that are not addressed unless you do this. And so I think what we'd be agreeing to is that that's ultimately what we want to build toward, I guess.
Okay, so I welcome comments, and I will clarify things, and then we can come back on it in a later meeting.
I think maybe what would be good, especially if we're not getting many comments about the proposal itself, maybe because just people agree, would be like, how do we incorporate this into the site? That's probably like the next step. Assuming that we have agreement on the content, it would be like, how do we incorporate it? Any other comment? Oh, Michael.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I'm gonna spend some time reading over. I hadn't seen the this policy before, so I'll make some comments, but I think generally it makes sense, and I think also some of it where you kind of, I think we need more of the what does SLSA not do, so that folks really understand like where does SLSA begin and end. Because I think that there has been some, like, hey, I did all the SLSA stuff, and you're like, yeah, but did you actually look at what you're building? You have provenance, so you could always go back and audit, but did you actually really look at what you were building? Because if garbage in is garbage out.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Roy's comments as well. Okay, so it sounds like there's no comments right now on the policy doc. I guess folks need some time to take a look.